continuations with your online class. Today we will explain your chapter 4, that is making a global world. Let me start with this. What is globalization? Globalization is a modern phenomenon that has sought to bring different countries, cultures and societies across the world closer to one another. Coming up to the first and to understand this topic, who all were the people who carry these ideas, the thoughts, the things from one place to another? Okay, so it was mainly the traders, the travelers, and the priests who ultimately led to the developments of the global world during the time. Now, how things and ideas travel was a very interesting phenomenon, and the most important things during that time was the Silk Road. This Silk Road was basically the foundations of exchanging the global phenomenon and that group ideas during those time, and it was an important examples of how trade and cultural exchange was carried out in ancient time between different parts of the world. And later on, we had witnessed transportations of this food, paper. Similarly, we also have this Chinese pottery. So another important things that traveled was this pottery. And in return, what was traveling to Europe from Asia was this gold and silver. Now, not only the things that were carried, besides that, the ideologies and the beliefs was also traveling, isn't it? And these many missionaries were traveling from this Europe to the regions of this Asia, and many Buddhists were traveling from this China and then nearby these areas to Europe. So there was a kinds of this interchanging ideas and philosophies, isn't it? That also took place with this Silk Road. So this Silk Road basically was the foundations for exchanging the global phenomenon. Okay, the global ideas during that time. It was the global ideas during that time, and then let's go to these interactions with the world. Now, how did people occupy one territory or another? Okay, a common explanations. If I ask you, you would say the by conquest, by military, or by army. No, but the real conquest or the real acquisitions of land in another area was not because of this conquest. It was much beyond conquest, and it was basically by the ideas of this spreading disease. A very good example here was when Europeans tried to capture the regions of this America. They bought a disease of this smallpox, and the American did not have a good immunity for this smallpox, and many of these Americans died even before the Europeans could come back to their lands. Okay, so that was the idea that Europeans had in mind to conquer areas in different lands during those period. Okay, so conquering became a very good idea during that time. Now the silver was going in Peru and Mexico. So when the silver was going from this region of this South America into Europe, Europeans' wealth was enhanced. And similarly, one of the very good example was this El Dorado, which was also known as the fabled cities of gold during that time. Okay, and we have already understood about how smallpox was one of the major diseases that was spread in that region. Now, what was happening in America and what was happening in this contemporary Europe during that time? The things were different, and Europe in urban areas and in or in this crowded locality, there were industrializations coming up, and this leads to poverty, hunger attended its peak, and we will see these Great Depressions periods of these 1830s, and we will see again the streets were overcrowded and there were lots of diseases. So that were prevalent, and religious conflicts were there, And the people who were working in these plantations were coming as these slaves. So all this affected the economy or the things in Europe. On the other hand, in the 18th century, India and China were prospering too good. Now, what happened in China? China adopted a kind of isolation policy. Because of this isolation policy, all the modernizations and the spread of this modernization shifted westward towards this America, and slowly and gradually Europe and America became the centers of the world trade during those periods. Okay, and now we go to this global agricultural economy. Now, if we look back to the 1815 and 1914, the flow of trade, labors, and movements of this capital for so all these trees were important for long terms and this short terms investment. Okay, again, traditionally the economy was considered self-sufficient, but as we move on to the 19th century for Britain, in this, the standards of living were lowering and social conflicts were going momentums and the population was increasing. So, therefore, there was increase in demands for more productions and food prices were rising and the local populations could not meet this rising food price. Along with that, these corn laws was being passed. These laws restricted imports of these corns into Britain with the increase of these populations of Britain. In the late 18th century, the demands of these food grains went up and the demands of people necessitated with the withdrawals of these corn law. Okay? Because of all these industrial revolutions, the world economic change, industrialization created the following four needs. Yeah. After the creations of these industrializations, what does industrializations needs? It needs which in turn leads to the colonizations of the parts of this America, Africa, Asia by countries in Europe. So they colonize because of the needs for these raw materials, because of these cheap labors and for their capitals and for the needs of these markets where they could sell their manufactured goods. Okay, and thus these globalizations lead to the formings of these economic integrations and agreement between these sovereign states. The economic integrations of this country took a varieties of forms which we have evolved over the years. It resulted in the integrations of these preferential tariffs, free trade association, custom unions, common markets, economic unions, or full economic integrations. Okay, and next we go to trade between the two world wars. The First World War was the first modern industrial war. During the war, industries were reconstructed to produce related goods, and this war transformed the US from being an international debtors to an international creditors. Okay, after the war was over, the production produced and unemployment increased. And in USA was the first to recover. Okay, in USA, war recovery was quicker. Mass production lowered the cost and prices of these engineered goods, and there was housing and consumer boom in 1920s, which ultimately leads to the Great Depressions of these 1920s and leads to the failures of this. Because of these Great Depressions, it leads to failures of bank and the crisis affected other countries severely. Okay, India was also affected by these Great Depressions. Indian exports and imports declined extensively. Prices fell and a large-scale migration took place from villages to towns and cities. And let's go to these post-war settlements and the Bretton Woods system. To ensure a stable economy of a framework was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary Fund and the Financial Conference held at Bretton Woods in the New Hampshire, USA. It established the International and Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. This IMF was set up to deal with the internal surpluses and deficit of these member nations, and this Bretton Woods system was based on a fixed exchange rate. Decisions making in this institution is controlled by this Western industrial power, largely by this USA, okay? And many countries in Asia and Africa became independent nations supported by this UNO and this NAM. And groups of 77 or G77 was organized by developing countries and to demand a new international economic orders, okay? And lastly, let's see these positive impacts and the negative impacts of these globalizations. Positive impacts: it improves qualities of goods and service. It leads to the remarkable economic growth across the world, and foreign investment flows into the domestic, and this increased opportunities of employment, and it increased it created a better quality of life for the people. And globalization also takes care of this issue of this social justice, okay? And let's see this negative impact. It has given rise to serious risks for countries which are unable to compete internationally. Globalization has been unable to ensure equitable distributions of the improved goods and service, and a large downsizing of this workforce caused by many unskilled workers. They lost their jobs, okay? And many countries in the world still continue to be exploited by the developed countries in the forms of this neo-colonialism. Okay. Kati zong ka voina kan explain thei chuni se in homework tur chu globalization chapter ami answer in brief question 1 to 7 ka in lo by ha tek donya. Oh, thank you all.